Oops. It's not your fault. Totally my bad. Okay. So, these three are grayed out because they're all to do with the definition of different parts of the nervous system, all right, with the organization. So I'll show you there's a good organization chart in your chapter. What is the structure of a neuron? Okay, so just like there will not be a heart on the exam that you have to label, right? That's an A&P question, okay? So does that mean you don't need to understand the structure and function of the heart? No, right? You've got to know that structure because otherwise some of the other information doesn't make sense, right? Same when we get to this chapter, there won't be a nerve to label, but if you don't understand the structure of a neuron, then some of the other information is going to be confusing, all right? All right, so our nervous system is very complex, all right? We have evolved this conscious awareness that we have that not very many other creatures on the planet have, right? If you put them in front of a mirror, they don't recognize that the thing they're looking at in the mirror is themselves, right? So that's something that we have that some other animals and birds and things have. Like a dolphin can do that. If you put a mirror in front of a dolphin, it can tell whether it's looking at itself or looking at a family member, okay? So we're not the only ones that have that ability to be consciously aware of our body and our look and that, but it is kind of special. Right? Memories, sensations, perceptions. So perception is really interesting because it's a completely abstract idea. Right? I put two pieces of information together and I can perceive something that I didn't necessarily see. Right? I might not have experienced it, but I have a perception of what it means. Right? I know that there's a corridor out there. Right? Even though I can't see it if I'm in the room. Central nervous system will initiate movements in response to sensory inputs, right? And we've also got those subconscious reflexes that are occurring at the spinal cord level that we mentioned briefly when we looked at Golgi tendon organs and muscle spindles. And one of the main jobs for our nervous system is to try to regulate our body and keep it within these very tight constraints, very tight boundaries that we are healthy within, right? So my body temperature can only fluctuate a little bit without me becoming or feeling quite unwell, okay? So if I'm going to maintain what we call homeostasis, right, level playing field there, I'm going to keep myself within this tight boundary, I've got to be able to A, recognize when my boundaries are being pushed or exceeded, right? And then, having recognized that the boundary has been exceeded, I have to be able to initiate something to pull me back to within my range that I'm healthy in, okay? So the definition of homeostasis is my ability to maintain equilibrium. So can I adjust, can I recognize and then adjust physiological functions and maintain them within these very tight constraints? Right? So when we look at exercise, exercise immediately challenges homeostasis. Okay? We see an increase in body temperature. Right? We see an increase in heart rate. We see an increase in our blood pressure. We see changes in hormone balance and pH balance within the bloodstream and within the muscle tissue. We see changes in the level of blood glucose in the bloodstream, right? Particularly if we're doing something that is longer duration so that we access stored glycogen in the liver, then it has to dump that into the bloodstream as glucose. Right? So remember, the key here, what makes this tricky, is that not only do I have to monitor that this is happening, I then have to be able to put the body back into its resting state at the end of the exercise period, right? I've got to be able to respond and bring the body back down. So we have several versions of feedback systems that talk between the nervous system and the sensory organs typically, all right? So one is a positive feedback loop, right? So a positive feedback loop intensifies something that's already happening. So here, an example would be that when we exercise and we see an increase in acidity levels in the bloodstream, that stimulates increased blood flow to that area, all right? That extra blood flow allows further activity to occur, and that stimulates more acidity, which increases blood flow, right? Which is a good thing. So that's a positive feedback loop. More common, though, in the human body are negative feedback loops, right? Negative feedback loops tamp down the intensity of a process that's occurring, right? So when I am extremely hot, particularly internally, so when my core temperature is rising, then that will trigger a sweating mechanism, and sweat on the skin then evaporates and acts as a cooling, one of the cooling options that we have. Right. So regulating all the disturbances that occur during exercise requires many different loops for the central nervous system to monitor what's happening. Okay? So brief review of what a nerve cell looks like. Hopefully that looks familiar. All right, there's lots of different types of nerve cells. They don't all look like this, but they all have one or more dendrites, they all have a cell body, they all have an axon, right? They all receive information via the dendrites and send information on down the road via the axon. Bless you.
Thank you.
Like muscle tissue, nerve tissue is electrically excitable, so it can carry a charge, just like we looked at when we said that the charge, the signal from the central nervous system runs across the surface of the muscle. because that muscle tissue is excitable. Right? Same thing with nerves. Okay? What has to happen for the signal to be carried by the nerve is that there's a threshold at the level of the cell body. Well, it's actually here, but we'll talk about it as if it's the cell body. It's the hillock. All right? And all the signals coming to that nerve cell get accumulated, and if they pass threshold for that cell, then the signal will carry on down the axon. Signal, the fancy name for the signal is the action potential. Right? So we have this summation of all the information coming in. If it reaches threshold for that nerve, then the signal will be sent on down the axon. And in our case, because we're particularly interested in the integration of the nervous system with the muscular system, this is going to be a motor nerve, and that signal will carry on down and be transmitted to the muscles so that we see contraction. So as I said, there's lots of different types of nerves of neurons. The ones that we're particularly interested in, our functional ones, are our sensory nerves. The sensory nerves are responsible for carrying information from a sensory organ, for example, a muscle spindle, to the central nervous system. All right? So you can all hear me because auditory nerves are picking up vibrations in your ear and sending information to your brain, and your brain is interpreting that information as my voice. Right? Then we have our motor nerves, which take a motor pattern, kind of a command for a movement from the central nervous system out to a muscle. Right? Now, motor nerves are really interesting because there's only one motor nerve. It has one axon, can be short or long. Bless you. So the cell body sits in the spinal column, but the axon comes out and can go to a respiratory muscle. Right? Well, in that case, the axon is quite short. But if you curry, right, and it's the motor nerve to your big toe, how tall are you? 6 foot. Right? That's a long axon all the way down to his big toe. Right? It doesn't, there aren't more motor nerves, it's just the one nerve. Well, more than one nerve, but that motor nerve only has one axon. Right? And then the other one we're a little bit interested in, we won't spend too much time on, but we want to understand some of the jobs that they can do because they're particularly useful when we're looking at these reflexes and at some of the training adaptations that we see, are interneurons. And interneurons are found within the spinal column, and they connect the sensory and motor nerves. Go back a minute. Don't forget your myelination on a motor nerve. Right? everybody remember about nodes of Ranvier and myelination? Because we're going to come back to that idea when we look at how the signal travels down the axon. Alright, so we assume we met threshold at the axon hillock at the cell body. We assume that a signal then, an action potential, has run down the axon and has reached the fingers of the axon, right? And then that signal has to be transferred to the next excitable tissue. So that's either going to be another nerve, a dendrite of another nerve, or it's going to be the surface of the muscle that is going to contract. Okay? So what we have is a little tiny gap, and that electrical signal can't cross a gap. So it has to turn into a chemical signal. The chemical can flood across the gap and attach to receptors on the other side and initiate another action potential. The chemicals, because they've got a specified job, are called neurotransmitters. Right? The neurotransmitter, when we are talking about the neuromuscular junction, which is the junction between the motor nerve and the muscle, is a neurotransmitter called ACH. It's acetylcholine. Right? But ACH, again, much easier to remember, and you can always look it up if you can't remember acetylcholine. Pens are running out. So we have an electrical signal coming down the nerve. It transfers into a chemical signal across the synapse. Okay. On the other side of the synapse, it's going to attach to receptor cells. And again, if there's enough of it attaching, we will initiate another electrical signal action potential on that next cell, muscle, or nerve. Okay? So the chemical bit is the neurotransmitter. At the neuromuscular junction, that neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. Question. So the receptor on the other side of the synapse is made up of a protein, and they are designed to very specifically match a chemical transmitter. All right, so acetylcholine coming across the synaptic cleft can't attach to a receptor for a different kind of chemical. Right? It can only attach to an acetylcholine receptor. Okay? That's really useful because at some of these synapses, there's more than one signal occurring at the same time, and so the nerve that's being stimulated needs to pick up the right information. Right? So don't worry too much. Again, it's more than we need. We just need to understand that because these receptors are unique, that means we can't make a mistake in identifying the next signal that's coming. Right? As I said, if enough neurotransmitter attaches to the receptors, then we stimulate another action potential, right? And we do that by opening ion channels. So if I've got enough acetylcholine coming across the neuromuscular junction and enough of it attaches to protein receptors on the muscle fiber, on the sarcolemma, right? Then we get an action potential that runs across the surface of the sarcolemma, down the T-tubules, stimulates the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium, and hopefully that then generates sliding filament theory and we see contraction. Typically, when we look at these synapses, only one type of ion gets to pass across the membrane, but it so happens that at the neuromuscular junction we have two types of ions. We have potassium and sodium. We're going to come back to that idea of ion channels. So if you have questions, make sure you ask me, right? Because if you don't understand the idea, the kind of global idea of these gateways almost, the ion channels are like gateways, all right? Then when we look at actually how those work, that will get confusing. All right, so I'm not going to go through this. Okay, this is a layout. We're going to very, very quickly discuss the elements of it, but again, the exam is not AMP. However, if you don't know the difference between the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, you're going to get some stuff wrong on the exam. Right? Because there's an assumption that you know this already. Okay? All right, so central nervous system first, made up of the brain and the spinal column. All right? In the brain we have the cerebrum, which we think is where our consciousness kind of comes from. And then we have the cerebellum. So our cerebrum is this kind of big, wavy, folded bit that sits on the top. And the cerebellum sits back here. If you look at this diagram, it's really interesting the way that this developed, because the central sulcus is the big kind of gap that runs across the middle. Okay? In front of the central sulcus, you have the motor cortex, okay? Directly behind the central sulcus, you have the sensory cortex. That's pretty useful, because that means that information between the motor cortex and the sensory cortex doesn't have a lot of distance to travel, right? Which is great, because when that tiger's running at you, if your sensory cortex was down here, and your motor cortex was over here, you'd be standing there going, there's a tiger, there's a tiger, I kind of need to move my legs, but it would be taking a very long time for that signal to get from the sensory cortex to the motor cortex, right? But it doesn't happen like that because they lie right next to each other. Okay? The cerebellum. So when the motor cortex initiates a signal, it comes and passes through the cerebellum and it gets tweaked. So the cerebellum is considered the center for coordination. right? The hypothalamus is kind of inside in here, and then you've got the brainstem that has areas that regulate kind of subconscious things that have to keep going: digestion, breathing, heartbeat, blood pressures, okay? So this beastie here is pretty precious. Okay? How many of you have seen a brain? Couple. Oh, quite a few. Good. Okay. Right? It's really soft. Very, very delicate, soft tissue. Easily damaged. So when I fall off the beam and smack my head on the floor, right, it gets damaged. Right? When you guys bang into each other on the field, it gets damaged. Okay? Because although it's encased in this nice hard sheet of bone that we have up here, there's a bit of a space. It can move around in there. Right? It's in like a little pool of fluid up there. So when your head moves, it's like a delay, right? So think about it this way. When you're in the car and you're not really paying attention and the person who's driving slams the brakes on and you go before your seatbelt pulls you back, that's what happens to your brain, right? It keeps moving until it hits the skull, right? So it's very easy to damage our little brains. And we do it a lot when we're sport people. And there's piles and piles of research that indicates the problems that concussions can cause, particularly multiple concussions, right? So we've got problems with memory recall for people who've had multiple concussions. There are some indications that it can be linked to Alzheimer's, depression, possibly Parkinson's in people that have had multiple concussions. Okay? One of the tricky things when you're coaching or when you're in charge of people who are moving is that concussions have a wide range, right? They don't necessarily result in a blackout. A bad concussion results in a blackout. But you can have a very small one and barely even see any symptoms of that. And the symptoms aren't always immediate, right? There can be a delay of up to 36 hours or so on some of these symptoms, right? So your athlete or your PE student or your client may go home and say, oh, I feel fine, it's okay, right? And then they wake up in the middle of the night feeling really nauseous with a pounding headache that didn't identify when they were with you, right? So there's lots of problems. Another problem that we see that they have really good research on now is the fact that once you've had one, you are way more prone to another one. Because that little bit of bruising and damage that you did doesn't heal completely. And so another shake, another knock means that there's a little bit already there and then it can re-bruise very easily, right? So I've put an article up that you need to read called Why Is It So Hard to Stop Sports Concussions? Right? So one of the things the article discusses is the fact that there's been quite a lot of money poured into trying to improve helmets.
Is it for what?
Yes. For certain games like American football. Okay? But now they're noticing that actually what happens is I give my high school football player a better helmet. And so we say, okay, now you're more safe because you've got this better helmet. And then you're less careful, right? So you dive in head first even more because you think you're invincible now because you've got the magic helmet on, right? Helmets for bike riding have been changed quite a lot, right? So now you can tighten them, you can buy some really clever ones where the inside foamy bit of the bike helmet sits firm and the shell can move. There's a lot of very clever technology trying to protect this. But we're not really doing very well because the problems with concussions are getting really worse in a way, not better. We are getting better at detecting them. We've got better assessments to try to identify even low-level concussions so that we can pull that person out for enough time to give that brain tissue time to recover properly. Right? But it's not something to be sniffed at. It's really dangerous. People are dying because of concussions. Okay? And you can get them. I've had a few. The last one I had was falling out of a tree trying to rescue my cat. I climbed up in the tree, I got the cat, I stepped back onto where I thought the branch was, and it wasn't there, and I fell out of the tree and whacked my head on the floor. I was sick as a dog. That was not good, right? But, so it's not even just sports people. Okay, it's everybody. It's just that depending on the sport you play, you're at more or less risk. Soccer players, basketball players, right? High risk football players, gymnasts, high risk. Okay. And at high school, remember that not all high schools have athletic trainers. So who's in charge of identifying the concussion? Right? The coach or the PE teacher, right? And who's in charge of making the decision about whether that individual gets to go back out and play again? You, right? So it's something to spend time learning about. We could do I think we could do a whole class on concussions, to be quite frank. There's so much information now. Spinal cord. Go to see the body if you get the chance. It's amazing. They have an entire spinal cord and nervous system pulled out and isolated. It's phenomenal. It's a little creepy, but it's phenomenal to look at, right? It's incredible how many, because we look at these diagrams and we're like, oh yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. When you look at it, there's hundreds of nerves coming out of the spinal column and radiating out across your body, right? It's phenomenal. So what we want to pay attention to with our spinal column is what's going on with these reflex actions, okay? Remember that a reflex action is involuntary. That means it did not have to go all the way up to the brain to drop its signal off for the brain to send a signal back to the muscle, right? It's going to wrap around within the spinal column without any input from the brain. Doesn't mean the brain doesn't get some of that information, because it will pass up a pathway to the brain as well. But we can see the reflex, the motor pattern, in response to the stimulus without the brain being involved. So I have an electric cooker, I've got the hob on, I forget I've got the hob on, I put my hand down. Right? Well, if it had to be a voluntary response, I'd have a big hole in my hand. Right? But because it's a reflex, I can pull my hand off hopefully quickly enough before I've done too much damage. Okay. And these reflex actions and the learning that goes on within the spinal column is quite important when we look at very high quality movement patterns. So high quality sportsmen. Okay. All right. So we will have a look at a myotatic reflex on Prolix. And I will, I'm almost certain I'm going to have to rejig that timetable, so just keep an eye on Blackboard and I'll put a new schedule out.
So the whole will meet you where? Here?
Yes, meet me at the lounge,
Okay.
8:40 at 8:30.
At 8:30?
And I'll give you the equipment and we'll run through the theory behind what we've got to do and the technique and stuff, and then hopefully the gym will be open
This part of
and you
it.
guys can go down there and do.
Shorts and t-shirt, or what do we?
Yeah, you're gonna do a vertical jump, a long jump, and a medicine ball throw.
Or just,
So 8:30? Yeah.
I used to have.
And you're coming as well, Serena, right?
Yes.
And where's Molly? You never know.
I actually just got a text
Huh?
from her while we were in class.
It's 1-0 right now still.
She
It's
said,
bad.
she just said if we're going to do our last.
Yeah.
What day is it today?
We're on the
Oh,
Tottenham with no Kane,
Okay.
no
She
Son.
has another
nothing.
council.
There is such a boring team. They're just
Okay. It's
average.
because we had Monday off, I was forgetting it.
Yes.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, still up.
Yeah, so just let her know the meet us
Okay.
there.
No.
But, yeah, we're not trying
It
to.
should be done now. No, in Atlanta, but still, 4-1-4.
Oh, vertical jump. I used to have good vertical, but I haven't looked at legs in a very, very, very long time.
But well, I have my own program that I've done, so here or just submit it in the submission box.
I don't know if it's open,
Okay.
so it's to me.
I'm on that membership as well. Do you have it off or do you want that you
So
use
you're popular.
Right? Like, it is.
both? Maybe?
I don't like being popular.
If you, but email, yeah, email it and
I'll see you later.
Okay, I'll see you tomorrow morning.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah,
Means I
8:30.
have to go in and change your athlete report that I just did this morning.
Saying I was a terrible athlete.
Crunch, crunch. Oh well.
What happened?
I forgot to turn this on at the beginning for the